We've been talking about the fate of Native Americans after the American Civil War. Much of that story took place during the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th century. It was called the Gilded Age because it was a period of phenomenal industrial and technological growth, accompanied by an unprecedented wave of social chaos and poverty. And when I think of the Gilded Age, I always think of this interesting moment which I'm about to describe. It was November of 1896, and William McKinley had just been elected President of the United States. McKinley was a Civil War veteran, Republican governor of Ohio, and champion of the United States' new industrial millionaire class. McKinley stood for the preservation of the gold standard, which kept the nation's credit firmly under the control of Eastern banks. And he had defeated the Democratic contender, William Jennings Bryan, who expressed sympathy for organized labor, who called for the regulation of banks, a fairer tax system, and a more flexible money supply to help smaller farmers. As the election returns came that night, the elite clubs of New York, Chicago, and Boston were full of men ecstatic with joy. They had paid an unprecedented sum to elect McKinley. His campaign chest rose to $10 million by the end of the contest, 30 times that of Bryan's. In one Chicago club, the men became so joyous they began a game of follow the leader. The other tycoons joined in. They danced across sofas and chairs and onto tables, and they snaked upstairs and downstairs. Finally, the line broke up and the men deliriously fell into each other's arms. Meanwhile, as winter approached, a wealthy Manhattan society woman named Cornelia Bradley Martin declared that she would celebrate the victory with a great big costume party. Cornelia's father was a millionaire merchant. Her husband was a banker. Now she wanted to make her mark on New York City, so she started organizing a big costume ball to take place on February 10th at the Waldorf Hotel in Midtown. The plan was to set a new record, to organize a bigger ball than Alva Vanderbilt's famous 1883 party, which most society experts regarded as the biggest party in the history of Manhattan. And so the Bradley Martin party was announced and the guests arrived. 700 members of America's super elite gathered at the hotel. The most popular costume for women was Marie Antoinette. 50 society ladies showed up as the wife of Louis XVI, the last king of France before the French Revolution. Cornelia's husband arrived as no less than Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. His mother arrived with $250,000 worth of jewels. The world-famous railroad financier, J.P. Morgan, came as the French playwright Molière. These people had more money than anybody ever had in history. By 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same income as the bottom half of the population. They owned more property than the remaining 99%. It was from their example that the economist Thorstein Veblen wrote his famous book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, in which he identified a new phenomenon, conspicuous consumption, as he called it. Unfortunately for the celebration, it took place during the Great Depression of the 1890s. In many cities, like New York City, the unemployment rate rose to 25%. There was no unemployment insurance at that time. There was no government family assistance. There was no health insurance system. Families sought shelter in government buildings during the winter of 1897. They lived in the streets, in basements, wherever they could. In the midst of this poverty and squalor, critics denounced the party as an inappropriate display of ostentation and wealth. The minister of the city's most fashionable Episcopal church, St. George's Church of New York, told his congregation, which included J.P. Morgan, not to go to the party. Never were the lines between the two classes, those who have wealth and those who envy them, more distinctly drawn. This party's costly manifestation of wealth will stir up widespread discontent. That's what the minister warned. The pastors of all the big churches followed and denounced the party. This money should be used for philanthropy, they declared, not a fancy rave for the super rich. Newspaper editors wrote about the ball and quoted Shakespeare. "What fools these mortals be," declared the Chicago Tribune, quoting from Midsummer Night's Dream. They asked why so many guests came to the ball as royalty rather than as George Washington or another of America's early presidents. As for the city of New York's government, its chief of police put 250 men outside the party for protection. But the city, seeing how much money the Bradley Martins had, raised their property taxes. Alienated by the experience, the couple sold their New York mansion, gave a farewell dinner party at $116 a plate, and moved to London. Eventually, the Great Depression of the 1890s subsided. Things got a little better economically in the early 20th century, but the assumptions of the Gilded Age stuck around, that the country was better off letting the business sector, the growing corporate sector, handle everything. If workers couldn't find work, it was because they were lazy. If they couldn't put food on the table, they should go to the local church. If they couldn't afford health care, they should go to a charity hospital. These presumptions continued right through the second decade of the 20th century, the 20s, and they were heightened, made more extreme by the suspicion and intolerance many Americans had for the millions of immigrants who arrived in the USA in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. As your Eric Foner book notes, during the years 1840 to 1914, probably around 40 million people immigrated to the USA. They fled poverty in rural southern Europe, especially southern Italy, and they came also from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and they fled burdensome taxation in China. And after 1911, many fled the turmoil associated with the Mexican Revolution. On the East Coast, they entered the U.S. via Ellis Island in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. On the West Coast, they passed through Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay Area. And once they got here, they were welcomed by employers as cheap labor and regarded with suspicion by everybody else, especially after the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917, in which pretty much every immigrant, regardless of their actual politics, came to be suspected as being some kind of a Ruski radical. It was in this context that a couple of Italian immigrants named Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested for allegedly participating in a robbery in a town near Boston, Massachusetts. They were, in fact, anarchists who wanted to abolish the state, which they saw as an instrument of class oppression. But there's little evidence linking them to this crime. Most witnesses did not identify them as there. Their fingerprints were not on the crime scene or the weapons found. They possessed none of the stolen money. But this did not stop the courts and even an inquiry panel run by the head of Harvard University from convicting them and sentencing them to death. Sacco and Vanzetti died in the electric chair on August 23, 1927, despite appeals from around the USA and the world to spare them. The last word on the tragedy went to a then famous journalist, Haywood Baroun, who wrote, and I quote, "It's not every prisoner who has the president of Harvard throw the switch for him." Despite this bitter comment, most mainstream Americans shrugged the case off. The Republican Party remained the dominant political party of the age, as it had been following the American Civil War. But its message was no longer about free labor. Its message was about the promises of technology and the corporation. And I quote, "The chief business of the American people is business," declared President Calvin Coolidge in the mid-1920s. Productivity and economic output skyrocketed in the 1920s as new industries, chemicals, electronics, exploded across the economic landscape, and all these industries found themselves feeding into the main miracle of the age, the automobile. The car extended its reach deep into the industrial life of America and out across the consumer sphere. The car was the preferred big purchase of working and middle-class Americans. By By 1929, 50% of American families owned a car. Plants like General Motors tripled their product output, and the car stimulated industrial production elsewhere. As an assembly line product, it voraciously consumed everything we associate with industry: copper, tin, rubber, steel, oil, glass, wood, concrete. All raw material roads now led to the making of cars. And there were all kinds of other goodies walking out of the industrial door: washing machines, radios, phonographs, movies, the crossword puzzle, the hairdryer, Q-tips, Kool-Aid. But beneath this explosion of consumerism, the signs of a fundamentally weak economy were there to see. Real wages for workers were rising at a much slower rate than production, and corporate profits. By 1929, 5% of American families took in more national income than the bottom 60%. 40% of the population lived in poverty, and at least half the population could not afford to buy most of these wonderful things. They owned no car, no radio, no washing machine. They lived from day to day. And these were city people. In the countryside, farmers were suffering. They had borrowed billions to feed troops during World War I. Now the war was over. Global demand was down. Global competition was up. And mechanization made it easier to produce more cotton, wheat, and corn than ever, driving farm prices down. To cite one effect, between 1921 and 1925, no less than half of farmers in Montana foreclosed on and lost their farms. For all practical purposes, the Great Depression of the 1930s started in rural America in the 1920s. Despite this, the businessman in the 1920s was God. The auto innovator Henry Ford, the engineer Herbert Hoover, these were the leaders of the so-called New Era, as it was called. And when I say gods, I mean gods. In 1925, an advertising executive named Bruce Barton wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows that described Jesus as the world's greatest advertising executive. Barton's book rescued Jesus from his image as the famished, bow-legged wastrel on the cross and turned him into a corporate outdoorsman. Jesus was, Barton insisted, a he-man, a term invented in the 1920s, a virile, go-getting he-man of business who, quote, picked 12 men from the bottom ranks and forged a great organization. The Man Nobody Knows became a national bestseller. In this context, social movements that had thrived in the early 20th century now took a nosedive. Union participation in the workplace declined in face of disinterest and, in many instances, employer-sponsored violence. Organized feminism, which had succeeded in winning women the right to vote in 1920, declined throughout the 1920s. Efforts to add an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution failed, and in 1929, Congress repealed a bill that provided federal aid to programs for infant and child health. A succession of pro-business Republican presidents accompanied this decade. Warren Harding, inventor of the word normalcy, dropped dead in 1923, leaving behind the most corrupt presidency in history, at least back then, and an illegitimate child for whom he left nothing in his will. Calvin Coolidge became famous for exactly one thing: his ability to say as little as possible throughout his single term. The apocryphal story has it that at a White House dinner party, a woman walked up to Coolidge and disclosed that she had made a bet with her sister that she could make the president say 3 words. Coolidge turned to the lady and said, "You lose," and walked away. Most Americans ignored all this and instead immersed themselves in a series of culture wars that permeated the 1920s. On one side stood a huge anti-modernist backlash that supported prohibition, the suppression of the sale of intoxicating beverages via a constitutional amendment, that supported the Immigration Act of 1924, which sharply curtailed immigration to the USA, especially from Eastern and Southern Europe, that supported the Christian fundamentalism of Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson, flamboyant Christian fundamentalists who garnered huge mass followings throughout the decade, and worst of all, supported the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terrorist organization that saw its height in the 1920s, opposed liquor, immigrants, and integration, and publicly lynched African Americans, Mexican Americans, and some whites with impunity from Oregon through Alabama. At the same time, social movements proliferated that embraced modernity, most notably the Harlem Renaissance, that produced a generation of black musicians and poets such as Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston, and a lost generation of writers such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote novels celebrating urban life and the individual pursuit of pleasure, and a larger generation of Americans who openly defied prohibition, which, I must editorialize here, was an incredibly stupid idea. Many of these defiers, by the way, were women, the so-called flappers of the 1920s, who reveled in the speakeasies of the Prohibition era and created their own defiant cultural feminism in the process. All these people subscribed to a better idea that developed during these years, the idea that citizens of the United States should have access to something called civil liberties. During World War I, the government repressed tens of thousands of people simply for saying that they opposed U.S. entry into the war. The head of the Socialist Party of America, Eugene Debs, was sentenced to years in federal prison just for giving a mild anti-war speech in Ohio. In states like Montana, men and women were thrown into prison just for saying in a bar that they did not like the war for some reason. And in a court case called Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court validated the prosecution of a man who had written a pamphlet against the draft, insisting that his action posed a, quote, clear and present danger. Free speech, the court ruled, quote, would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. Censorship of all kinds persisted into the 1920s. Censorship of books that local morals groups regarded as dirty. The U.S. Customs Service blocked entry of the works of the French Renaissance writer Rabelais and the contemporary novelist James Joyce, and whoever else's work they thought was just a little too naughty and frisky. In response to the World War I crackdowns, a group of activists in 1917 decided that they'd had enough of all this repression, and they started an organization that I'm sure that many of you have heard of called the American Civil Liberties Union. And they basically just started suing the government for infringing on the rights of Americans to free expression, and they began persuading the courts to side on behalf of personal freedom rather than government repression. By the last year of the 1920s, they had persuaded the Supreme Court to strike down a Kansas law that made it a crime to advocate civil disobedience to change the political system. In 1930, the High Court, the Supreme Court, overturned the conviction of a woman named Mary Ware Dennett for sending a sex education pamphlet through the mails. In 1933, a federal court overturned a customs service ban on James Joyce's novel Ulysses. But the most famous case that the American Civil Liberties Union was involved in the 1920s focused on the right to teach scientific facts in the classroom. In 1925, a great trial took place in Dayton, Tennessee, which, for millions of Americans, represented the great battle between modernity and tradition, the Scopes monkey trial. There, a jury was to decide the fate of John Scopes, a high school biology teacher charged with illegally teaching the theory of evolution. The guilt or innocence of John Scopes, and even the constitutionality of Tennessee's anti-evolution statute mattered little. The meaning of the trial emerged as a titanic struggle between modernity and tradition. In fact, the instigators of the trial had intended none of this. The chief culprit was a local booster named George Rabelais, a 31-year-old transplanted New Yorker. Rabelais was a coal company manager. He read in the newspaper that the newly formed American Civil Liberties Union was willing to defend anyone prosecuted under Tennessee's new law that prohibited the teaching of any evolutionary theory that denied the legitimacy of the teachings of the Bible. He had nothing but contempt for the law, but the truth was that he saw the trial as an opportunity to get Dayton on the map and show everybody what a great city it was. So he went to the local drugstore where most of the city's elder statesmen usually hung out, and Rabelais basically put the trial together. He got himself a victim, a young high school teacher named John Scopes, and he volunteered to be prosecuted. He convinced the town's city attorneys, both friends of Scopes, to prosecute Scopes, and he found a local crackpot who had recently lost his job at the state law school to represent Scopes, at least until the ACLU got there. Worst that would happen, they figured, is that Scopes would have to pay a fine. But almost immediately, unexpected things happened. The great populist politician William Jennings Bryan had long been watching the evolution question evolve, so to speak, for years, and he was very offended and even enraged by the extent to which Darwinism had, since the 1890s, been used to promote social Darwinism. He saw social Darwinism as an ideology that justified oppression, the oppression of workers, of the poor, of farmers, of the weak and the sick. The idea that you should just basically let nature somehow take its course and eliminate the weak of society. And the biology textbook that John Scopes used to teach Darwinism explicitly championed the survival of the fittest concept. Bryan had lost 3 presidential elections, watched the world go through a war he opposed, World War I. Bryan saw the Christian religion as a way to instill ethical values in people, and he resented the sense of personal superiority that Darwinist scientists often displayed over ordinary people and their faith-based scriptural beliefs. He often scoffed in his speeches. He said, "Men who would not cross the street to help a soul will travel around the world in search of a skeleton." Local fundamentalists invited Bryan to prosecute the case, and the great commoner saw a new crusade. To the dismay of Rapelye and his group, Bryan became the chief prosecuting attorney. Once that happened, the trial came to the attention of another celebrity. Clarence Darrow had won worldwide fame as a defense attorney. He had famously defended 2 young murderers, Leopold and Loeb, and saved them from the electric chair, largely by arguing that they were psychologically and emotionally educated by their school and personal background to commit the crime. Darrow was a passionate agnostic. He believed that maybe God existed, maybe he didn't exist, but we needed proof. And he detested what he saw as rural, anti-modern ignorance among Americans. And once Bryan became the prosecutor, Darrow rushed to the defense team's side. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was immediately put off by Darrow's presence, he, defender of murderers. Several prominent attorneys declined to aid the case now, including former presidential candidate Charles Evans Hughes, because they didn't want to associate with Darrow. The case had become polarized. Most Americans had long since come to terms with evolution. They just thought, and many still think, I believe, that God created evolution along with everything else, and all species on Earth had been evolving ever since. But this intellectual compromise was not possible now in Dayton. Now the town had Bible-thumping preachers holding gigantic prayer meetings every night with huge posters saying, "Read your Bible," and speeches about how God created man who did not come from the apes. Meanwhile, Dayton became Monkey Town, with street vendors selling toy monkeys to the thousands of reporters, preachers, hustlers, politicians, prostitutes, and gawkers who stormed into the city to follow the trial. As the historian Douglas Linder notes, opening statements picture the trial as a titanic struggle between good and evil, or truth and ignorance. Bryan claimed that if evolution wins, Christianity goes. Darrow countered, "Scopes isn't on trial, civilization is on trial." In the end, the trial came down to a battle between Bryan and Darrow. Darrow put Bryan up on the witness stand at the end. Darrow put Bryan on the stand to make a point that just because you teach evolution doesn't mean that you are denying God, just a narrow, literalist version of God. Darrow began his interrogation of Bryan with a simple question. Quote, "You have given considerable study to the Bible, haven't you, Mr. Bryan?" And Bryan replied, "Yes, I have. I have studied the Bible for about 50 years. Thus began a series of questions designed to undermine a literalist interpretation of the Bible. Bryan was asked about a whale swallowing Jonah. Joshua making the sun stand still, Noah and the great flood, the temptation of Adam in the Garden of Eden, and the creation according to Genesis. After initially contending that, quote, everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there, Bryan finally conceded that the words of the Bible should not always be taken literally. In response to Darrow's relentless questions as to whether the 6 days of creation, as described in Genesis, were 24-hour days, Bryan said, "My impression is that they were periods." Bryan, who began his testimony calmly, stumbled badly under Darrow's persistent prodding. At one point, the exasperated Bryan said, and I quote, "I do not think about things I don't think about." So Darrow asked, "Well, do you think about things you do think about?" And Bryan responded to the derisive laughter of spectators, "Well, sometimes." In the end, the jury convicted Scopes of the crime of teaching evolution, and the judge ordered his fine. The case was appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, where it was dismissed on a technicality. The jury, not the judge, should have set the fine, the High Court ruled, and the court dismissed the case rather than sending it back to Dayton for a retrial. Nothing, the court declared, is to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case. The Scopes trial was the quintessential battle between fundamentalism and modernity. It introduced the question of Darwinism to millions of Americans, yet the trial resolved nothing. Although there are no longer any states that ban the teaching of evolution formally, the pressure not to teach it in southern states and in many other areas is enormous. Many high school biology teachers simply skip the subject altogether rather than face angry parents and community groups. And yet even the alternative offered to evolution, so-called intelligent design, couches itself in the language of modernity, contending that life is too complex to have been created by an accidental process. By the mid-1920s, modernity was here to stay, and nothing demonstrated that so much as those who claimed to oppose it. But all these interesting and historically important cultural wars were taking place while the Great Depression was approaching. And ironically, the President of the United States, who would have to respond to the crisis, was a man who, up to that point, had never known failure. Herbert Hoover was an inordinately shy man who was born in West Branch, Iowa in 1874. His father was the village blacksmith. Both of his parents had died by the time he was 9. He went to live with his uncle, a country doctor, and went to a Quaker school, and as a teenager applied to Stanford University. Stanford's admission director noted that his grammar wasn't very good, but his talent for mathematics was considerable, and so he was admitted. And he took a degree in engineering, and he became a mining engineer. This was a way to travel around the world, and so young Herbert did. Australia, and eventually China, managing various mining operations. He became rich by investing in mines that he could see for himself were soundly organized. In China, he found himself in the middle of the Boxer Nationalist Rebellion, essentially a rebellion against foreign control, and he got a sense of how war and how war relief was organized. In 1909, Hoover wrote a book called Principles of Mining, a manual for engineers and managers that advocated unions for miners, the 8-hour day, and serious attention to mining safety. The book became a standard textbook in mining schools and helped spread Hoover's reputation as a progressive, enlightened businessman. In 1914, at the age of 40, having amassed a fortune, he retired from active business. His Quaker conscience prodded him towards good works. So did his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, who had graduated with a degree in geology from Stanford in 1899. Not surprisingly, during the First World War, he was asked to organize famine relief for Belgium, which he did with amazing success. The historian Geoffrey Perrott calls it, quote, one of the most effective humanitarian operations in human history. By the early 1920s, Russia was starving. The communist writer Maxim Gorky had made a moving appeal titled "To All Honest People" to help out with the famine. It was published in many newspapers. Hoover accepted the task of coordinating the relief effort, but under certain conditions. Control of distribution by the American Relief Administration, equal shares, regardless of quote-unquote class origins, full freedom of travel for Americans, release of Americans being held in Soviet Union prisons. Hoover managed to win a grudging $20 million contribution from Congress. The War Department handed over tons of surplus medical supplies. Hoover raised an additional $70 million in private contributions. At one public fundraising event, a wealthy society woman rose and protested, and in effect, he was saving the Bolshevik regime. Hoover lost his temper, a rare event. His face literally went red, and he banged on the table in rage, and he said, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. By the concluding days of the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty of World War I, Herbert Hoover was a celebrated man, one of the most famous humanitarians in the world. He caused mines to be reopened, rivers to be cleared, bridges rebuilt, loans to be made to desperate countries. When he spoke before American audiences, he exuded a sense of compassion that was both heartfelt and utterly rational. One day, President Woodrow Wilson's young Assistant Secretary of the Navy went to hear Herbert Hoover speak. Herbert Hoover was a wonder, declared Franklin Delano Roosevelt of New York. I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one. It is an irony that someone as compassionate and talented as Hoover would find himself on the losing side of history, while a man who had practically none of his meticulous knowledge and managerial skills, Franklin Roosevelt, would wind up on the winning side, largely because he was a good politician. It turns out that being good at politics is an important skill. But given Hoover's popularity in the 1920s, it's understandable that he couldn't resist the opportunity that presented itself when President Calvin Coolidge, held a press conference in the late summer of 1927. And it was a typical Calvin Coolidge press conference. He didn't say anything. He just handed the reporters each a piece of paper. It said, and I quote, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was it. Shortly after that, Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, made the biggest mistake of his life. He announced his candidacy for presidency. Hoover represented the ideal Republican candidate. He was a charitable person, a planner, intelligent, compassionate. He had completely avoided and transcended even the scandals of President Warren Harding. He had moved the nation with his skill at emergency assistance in Western Europe and Russia. As Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge, he urged industries to cooperate rather than engage in mindless competition so that more jobs would be more stable. He helped establish the Railway Labor Act of 1926 that gave railroad unions some union bargaining rights. He helped convince the steel industry to get rid of the 12-hour day. He chaired an important congressional committee investigating the Mississippi flood of 1927. Hoover was, in short, a straight-up, all-around good guy. In 1928, I might have voted for him. But Herbert Hoover was not a politician. In fact, his run for the presidency in 1928 was his first run for office. He didn't have a politician's flexibility, the flexibility you need to deal effectively with a crisis of the magnitude of what was about to come. Hoover's public ideology expressed itself entirely within the context of free market capitalism. He wanted capitalism to be human, to act human, but to be human voluntarily, he said. His idea was not to pass laws mandating the 12-hour day in steel, but to have his assistants go over to the Century Club in Manhattan and have a few martinis with J.P. Morgan the younger and Elbridge Gary and, chat it up with these millionaires. Guys, how's the wife and kids? And don't you think this 12-hour day thing has gone past its prime? In 1922, Herbert Hoover wrote a book called Cooperative Individualism that perfectly outlined this philosophy. He wanted a voluntary progressive capitalism, welfare capitalist systems with their pensions and company cafeterias and voluntary safety programs. That's what Herbert Hoover liked. And who can argue with that? I, too, want to live in a world in which everybody, especially people with money and power, always do the right thing voluntarily. And there's a place where that always happens. It's called heaven. Meanwhile, here on Earth, Hoover easily trounced his Democratic opponent, the mayor of New York, Al Smith, and won the White House. Smith had two disadvantages. First, he was a Catholic. Second, he opposed prohibition. Republicans called him Alcohol Al and claimed that he'd kissed the ring of the Pope. But flush with victory, what Hoover's supporters missed were all the cities whose populations voted overwhelmingly for Smith, anticipating the huge urban vote that was, for the first time, emerging across the United States. And Hoover had promised just a little too much in the campaign. I quote from one of his speeches: "The United States has come nearer to the abolition of poverty, to the abolition of fear or want, than humanity has ever reached before. The slogan of progress is changing from the full dinner pail to the full garage," suggesting that lots of Americans now had more than one car in their car garage. Well, a year after Hoover made those promises, the stock market crashed in New York City. The stock market had been flying into the stratosphere on the assumption that the economy would boom forever, but the law of gravity inevitably had to kick in. The stock market crash itself did not cause the Great Depression, but it fell with a severity that wrecked scores of investment companies and wiped out tens of thousands of investors who had literally borrowed millions of dollars to buy stock, and destroyed investor confidence in the production economy. Suddenly, 26,000 businesses failed in early 1930. Those that survived found themselves confronting the silent weakness that we talked about earlier. The workers and farmers who ran the breakneck production economy of the 1920s. They could not afford to buy all the products being churned out by America's factories and farms, nor could Europe, still recovering economically from World War I, pick up the slack. Over the next 2 years, the gross national product of the United States of America, the value of everything that the country produced and sold in the U.S. and elsewhere, fell by 1/3. In many industrial parts of the USA, communities were hit much harder. Chances are that most of you have never seen such a thing in your life. Imagine walking into your local shopping mall and 1/3 to half of the businesses disappearing. By 1932, U.S. Steel, the dynamo of the American economy in the 1920s, had laid off its entire workforce of 225,000 people. Banks that had invested in the stock market began to collapse. The founder of General Motors lost all his money and wound up running a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan. And he was lucky. Millions of Americans found themselves cut loose from the most basic foundations of society: work, housing, education, their families. The suicide rate rose to the highest in U.S. history. The birth rate fell to the lowest. The Great Depression, a perfect storm of economic calamity, had begun. I have to admit something to you at this point. I have kind of a soft spot for Herbert Hoover, who really did a lot of good things in the 1920s around technology and the economy and humanitarianism that we don't have a lot of time to talk about. But I do want to take a little time to rescue him from the standard high school advanced placement history narrative that you get. Hoover understood far better than most people around him that the economy was in trouble. Once the downfall began, he acted quickly within the limitations of his voluntary philosophy to get employers not to lay off workers and to get the wealthy and charity groups to help the unemployed as quickly as possible. But the economic class and political class around him simply had no idea what time it was. His wealthy Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, told Hoover that the Depression would help American society. It would make Americans tougher. And Hoover repeated these sort of ideas in public. Federal aid, he warned, weakens the sturdiness of our national character. The Republican Congress reached into its ideological toolkit and pulled out cures and nostrums that only made things worse. They raised duty taxes on imports via the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariff. So Europe raised duty taxes on American exports and more American factories closed. They raised taxes to reduce the federal deficit, which reduced consumer power, and more American factories closed. Eventually, Hoover realized that he had to move out beyond his 1920s ideological framework if he was going to help Americans get through this crisis. So he signed into law the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It loaned money to banks and other large essential businesses in trouble like railroads. Hoover also approved a bill that gave $2 billion to local relief groups. But Hoover took these measures in 1932, 3 years after the stock market crash of 1929, and after 3 years of devastating depression. And by then, he had solidified an undeserved reputation as heartless Herbert Hoover. During the First World War famine and relief campaigns, Finland had literally turned Hoover's last name into a verb. To Hoover meant to help someone. Now, homeless encampments were called Hoovervilles. Blankets for the homeless were called Hoover flags. Then, a social and political catastrophe took place right in front of President Hoover's front yard. I'm sure that none of you know of Mr. Walter W. Waters, although the name is easy enough to remember. Up until 1932, Mr. Waters lived a quiet and decent life. He served in the First World War as a sergeant. He was discharged from the Army in June 1919. He drifted around the Pacific Northwest. Eventually, he married and settled down in Portland, working in a cannery as an assistant superintendent. He had a wife and around $1,000 in the bank, and he was happy. Then in December of 1931, the plant laid off half its staff, including Waters. He was soon destitute, but he had one thing left: the cash value of his adjusted compensation certificate, otherwise known as the bonus. In 1924, Congress enacted over Coolidge's presidential veto a 20-year-old endowment policy, which matured at death or in 1945. It was a bonus for each veteran, with $1.25 for every day served overseas, plus 4% compound interest, up to the date of encashment. The average value was about $1,000. Waters and others wrote to Congress and said they wanted it all now. They needed it all now. And Congressman Wright Patman of Texas heard their plea, and he introduced a bill to authorize full payment before 1945, which the Congressional House Ways and Means Committee shelved, basically just put on delay. This galvanized Waters and his friends into action, and he and 300 other men set out with a drum to march on Washington. They had about $30 between them. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Hoover was angry about the veterans because he felt that they had already gotten plenty. He had signed a law that made all needy and sick veterans eligible for disability allowances. There were already 850,000 veterans receiving various kinds of government pensions, and he felt that this was plenty. But the nation was extremely sympathetic towards the veterans. Railroad engineers let them ride in boxcars. The National Guard escorted them through various states. Local veterans groups drove them through Indiana. By the time they got to Washington, D.C., they were 60,000 people strong. And to their amazement, they found a champion in Washington, D.C.'s chief of police, Brigadier General Pelham Glassford. 6 feet 3 inches tall, Glassford was. Retired from the Army, he loved to drive around D.C. in his enormous Army motorcycle, and he enjoyed working off hours as a circus roustabout, a casual laborer who set up tents and such. And he decided that these men were his heroes. He went to Capitol Hill to testify for them. He became their secretary-treasurer, and he authorized the Bonus Expeditionary Force to set up 27 encampments, men sent for their families. Hoover did what he could for the marchers. He authorized provisions of tents, cots, field kitchens, and even a military hospital for the sick. For 2 months, about 60,000 men and their families lived outside the Capitol building. The American Legion raised $5,000 for them. Well-wishers sent in nickels and dimes. The Patman bill was brought out of committee. It passed the House and was rejected by the Senate by 62 to 18 votes. A stunned California United States Senator Hiram Johnson turned to one of his colleagues, when the vote was announced. And he said, and I quote, "The time may come when these trappings of government will disappear, when fat old men like you and me will be lined up against a stone wall," and presumably shot. But the veterans realized that they had lost. Most began to break up camp and leave, but about 10,000 stayed, mostly because they didn't know where else to go. Now, there are about a dozen abandoned buildings in Washington, D.C. that the bonus force was using, and the local contractors who were scheduled to demolish them started pressuring their friends in government to get the men out, since it was the summer and now was the time for such work. Glassford got orders to get the squatters to leave peacefully and move to other sites, but 40 or so men tried to retake one of the buildings, and the police were outnumbered. Glassford himself rushed to the scene and was hit by a brick on the head. Later that day, another confrontation took place in which a policeman drew his revolver and fatally shot 2 men. Hoover then received a request for federal troops. Hoover granted the request, but with specific orders. The troops were not to be armed. The bonus marchers were to be cleared from the downtown area and escorted to various camps. Unfortunately, he gave the task to one Major General Douglas MacArthur, and MacArthur ignored Hoover's orders. His assistant Dwight Eisenhower was astonished to see MacArthur arrive on the scene complete with his horse and his medals. MacArthur asked Hoover for a proclamation of a state of insurrection, which Hoover responded was absurd. Undeterred, MacArthur marched his battalion at the veterans, with bayonets glittering in the sunshine. The treads of 5 tanks squeaking and clanking, the bonus army started throwing rocks. The soldiers fired tear gas in reply. MacArthur's assistant Major George Patton charged down Pennsylvania Avenue in the last mounted horse engagement of the U.S. cavalry. The bonus army fell apart under the onslaught of tear gas and sabers. At night, MacArthur's forces reassembled. Hoover ordered them not to attack. MacArthur ignored the order again and ordered his men to attack anyway. They moved into the final camps and they began burning the tents and ramshackle buildings. One wife of a veteran recalled the charge, and she said, and I quote, "The troops came up the hill driving the people ahead of them. As they passed by the house, one of them threw a bomb over the fence into the front yard, which is a few feet from the door. The house was filled with gas, and we all began to cry. We got wet towels and put them over the faces of the children. About a half hour later, my baby began to vomit. I took her outside in the air, and she vomited again. Next day, she began to turn black and blue, and we took her to the hospital, where the baby died." The veterans, realizing that they'd been trounced, simply completed the burning themselves and evacuated the area. For MacArthur, the battle was a total victory. For Hoover, it was a total catastrophe. Unwilling to make a public issue of MacArthur's insubordination, he lamely declared that the march had been organized by communists. The flames were, for all practical purposes, the funeral pyre of his reputation. This all took place in the last weeks of July in 1932. Then comes August and September and October, and then Election Day in November of 1932. Watching all this was the son of a gentleman farmer from Hyde Park, New York. Franklin Roosevelt was born into great wealth on January 30th, 1882, near Hyde Park, New York. He went to Groton Academy and then to Harvard. Roosevelt was brought up to believe 2 things. First, that his wealth bestowed responsibility upon him, and that he needed to remain disciplined despite his good fortune. The family had an old tradition of eating scrambled eggs and water on Friday nights, probably to remind the kids of what it might mean to be poor. FDR, in a term paper he wrote for Harvard, declared, and I quote, "The Roosevelts have never felt that because they were born in a good position, they could put their hands in their pockets and succeed. They have felt, rather than being born in a good position, there was no excuse for them if they didn't do their duty by the community." FDR's idol was his second cousin, former President Theodore Roosevelt, who had gone as far as to work on a ranch and take boxing lessons to prove that he was no rich sissy. FDR went as far as to marry Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, in 1905. FDR had won 2 terms as a Democratic New York State Senator. He'd served as Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and after the war he ran on the vice presidential slot along with James Cox. This is in the election of 1920, and they lost. And then Franklin Roosevelt got polio, and he almost died. And when he was in bed, his wife sort of took this as an opportunity to influence his thinking. Into his sick room came a steady stream of social reformers. Francis Perkins, Bill Moskowitz, a whole generation of people who Eleanor had come to know, Columbia University professors Rexford Tugwell and Raymond Moley and Adolph Burrell Jr., very influential writers about society and economics at the time. And they changed him, and when he recovered, his politics was different. FDR also pioneered water therapy as a way of developing upper body strength to compensate for the loss of his legs. He eventually bought a mineral water pool resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he gave scholarships to poor children who had contracted polio. Roosevelt's illness was, ironically, sort of an advantage for him. It made him the sole national Democrat who had largely kept out of the party's bitter battles and divisions in the politically difficult 1920s, when Al Smith stepped down after the presidential campaign of 1928, which he lost to Herbert Hoover. FDR ran and won the governorship of New York. This experience was important because it gave FDR an opportunity to deal with development and agricultural policy. People normally don't think about this, but New York is an agricultural state. Apples, corn, dairy, it's all over upstate New York. During his tenure, FDR came to the conclusion that the only way upstate farmers were ever going to have access to electricity is if the state developed it for them. He also pushed for state-supported old age pensions and unemployment insurance and set up the first state relief administration during the early years of the Depression. He was overwhelmingly reelected governor in 1930. He also managed to build a remarkable coalition in New York State between rural upstate farmers and so-called Tammany Hall immigrant-oriented political politicians in New York City. He appeared more and more to the national democratic structure like a unifier, a political healer, and this made him a formidable alternative to Al Smith. And then he ran for the Democratic presidential primary of 1932. Al Smith imagined that maybe he still had a chance, but he didn't. He lost to Roosevelt on the 4th ballot, who had cleverly put John Nance Garner, governor of Texas, on as his vice presidential candidate. And FDR flew to Chicago, and in his speech, his acceptance speech, he said the following. He said, and I quote, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Let us, all of us here assembled, constitute ourselves prophets of a new order of competence and of courage. This is more than a political campaign. It's a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win this crusade to restore America to its own greatness. It's largely forgotten that beyond this beautiful rhetoric, FDR promised relatively little of substance. He insisted that as president he would balance the national budget, which he never did, but he did campaign against prohibition. Ironically, Roosevelt's stance against prohibition in 1932 was a strength, whereas in 1928 it had been a weakness. With the gloss of the 1920s pseudo-prosperity gone, prohibition no longer seemed worth defending to millions of Americans. To the business community paying police bribes, it was no longer a viable option. To millions of out-of-work voters, it was unclear how 12 years of prohibition had made the United States of America any better. Of course, Roosevelt had another key advantage. He was not Herbert Hoover, blamed for the Great Depression. Forgotten in the 1932 campaign was the candidacy of Socialist Party candidate Norman Thomas. Well, Thomas, a Presbyterian minister from New York, had inherited the legacy of Eugene Victor Debs, or the great Gene Debs, as Thomas would say. Thomas ran for president as a socialist on the platform of progressive taxation, public housing, legalization of unions. And an elderly woman walked up to him after one of his speeches. Mr. Thomas, she said, I liked everything you said in your speech, but I'm not going to vote for you. I'm going to vote for Roosevelt. We've got to get that man. Herbert Hoover, of course. And Mr. Hoover lost the election, of course. Roosevelt received almost 23 million votes. The Electoral College margin was 472 to 59. Privately, what his supporters found in Roosevelt was a flexibility, a willingness to try anything, to experiment, to move quickly and without reluctance. Everybody agreed that he was not nearly as smart and informed as Herbert Hoover, but he exuded a confidence, an optimism, and a willingness to experiment that people found irresistible. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes called FDR a second-class intellect with a first-class temperament. America didn't need the smartest guy in the class, the polls were saying. What the country really needed now was a leader. The day before Inaugural Day, Roosevelt had pored over his inaugural speech. Sitting around was a copy of the collected writings of the famous American philosopher and writer Henry David Thoreau. He opened it up and found a page that said, and I quote, "Nothing is so much to be feared as fear." On Inaugural Day, March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt walked out to the Capitol Rotunda. Already photographers were honoring the Roosevelt rule. Never photograph him walking with crutches or in a wheelchair. He moved out, coatless and hatless, to the podium, and he said the following words, and I quote, "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. I am convinced that you will again give me that support in these critical days. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no markets for their produce. The savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it." In other words, the old free market voluntary order had collapsed. It had, in fact, begun to be abandoned by the man whom FDR had beaten, Herbert Hoover, and Roosevelt was essentially asking for wartime powers to deal with the crisis. And over the next year or so, he would get them. Congress would cheerfully pass things he proposed with little, if any, scrutiny. In fact, Congress would occasionally read that Roosevelt had proposed certain bills in the paper and passed them without reading his formally written proposals. It was a political carte blanche that only Woodrow Wilson and Abraham Lincoln had enjoyed in time of war, and would last off and on about 6 years. And we'll talk about what the New Deal accomplished and did not accomplish in our next lecture.